we're going to try to get started here. Some of you know Dr. Springer because you were here for a previous event. Some of you are patients of his as well, so thank you for coming today. But Dr. Springer is with the LifeWorks Wellness Center in Bel Air, and I'm very pleased to have him come back for part 2, brain food. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I appreciate Arden Kurtz having me back once again. We had some fun here a few months ago talking a lot about Alzheimer's and some positive intervention that we could try and do. So they asked me to come back and present a little something different. So I titled this talk, brain food. So first of all, a little show of hands. How many individuals here eat during the day? Please raise your hands. Okay, keep your hands up for just a second. Okay, and those of you who have a brain, let the lower your hands down, please. Anybody with your hands still up, we've got problems. We'll talk later. Brain food is kind of a large encompassing thing, and at the bottom of it you see it says eat before you think. Now what I mean by that is that, and that was not by accident, is that you need to be able to eat and eat properly in order to be able to think. As we go through our journey today talking about foods, good foods and everything else that's involved, you have to have a good diet, a proper diet, and one that's not inflammatory in order for you to be able to have good brain function or good body function as far as that's concerned. So we're interested in all sides of that. And when I say vice versa, I hope that after today I'll give you some tidbits to think about so that you'll actually be thinking about what you eat before you eat it, because it has a tremendous impact on your mental health as well as your physical health, and we're going to explore some of those things today. Anybody know what year this was? We put a man on the moon, right? 69. Absolutely. We put a man on the moon, and we did it in 1969. By the way, a little trivia question. How many times have we gone to the moon? How many men did we go to the moon? How many times? Everybody thinks one. It's actually 6. We've been to the moon 6 times. If I looked this up and said, I didn't know we were there 6 times. I forgot about that as well. So when the whole idea of this is that we can put a man on the moon, but did you ever notice we can't come to a consensus about how we should eat? High fat, low fat, high carb, no carb, Atkins, paleo, plant-based diet. Raise your hand if you're confused about what you should eat in your life. And because the thing is that we have so many different kinds of information. So what we want to be able to try and do today is to give you some of the latest information that's out there and confirmed by scientific studies as to what and how food affects us from a health standpoint all the way across the board. And this lecture reminds me a little bit of one I did in February of 1980. Now it goes back a ways. I had just graduated from medical school. My first lecture was on a subject, and if I surveyed this subject, people in your room, how many people know about trans fats? And most people raise their hand now. And if I survey, most people say, well, I've known about for about 8 or 9 years. And my first lecture on trans fats was indeed February of 1980. Back in 1980, we knew that trans fats were having issues. And it wasn't my discovery. It was some individuals on the leading edge of nutritional science, and they knew that trans fats were bad news. But back in the 1980s, margarine was the story of the day. And so it took some 20 years before it started getting on the radar screen of quote-unquote conventional wisdom. And some of the things you're going to hear about today are going to be 180 degrees opposite of what you've been told up until this point. So, and you may be it probably won't take another 20 years because our information is proceeding at such a quiet, quick pace. We didn't have the internet going back then so much, but now we've got tons of information pouring out quickly, so I think the information will occur much quicker. So you will hear some things today that I'll give you some of the scientific validation for that I think you will find interesting, if not helpful in terms of you move forward with your own diets. Now, some things are obvious, in terms of when we eat them, that they're going to have effect not only on our brain, as you see here, but also as far as our body is concerned. By the way, there is one typo on here. I'm sure because Cheetos are a well-known brain food. I just let you know. I eat plenty of Cheetos, and the best part of the Cheeto is good for your brain is the part that you lick off your fingers once you do that. So, and I'm sure everybody else would have their own, whether it's Oreos, whatever. Obviously, all kidding aside, we know that certain foods are not particularly helpful or helpful for us in terms of any kind of function as far as the body is concerned. And equally so, there are things we know we should be eating that are very good for us, fruits, vegetables. Obviously, most people know those kinds of issues. And we'll find out and learn some new things even about that today as we go along. And last time we were here, we talked about how the brain really gets the lion's share of the energy. And then up here it talks about we obviously have a lot of circulation going to the brain, but at any given time, that in terms of blood circulation, in terms of energy, upwards of 25% of the energy that is being used and is available in the body is being used by the brain. How many people in here think? So if you think, you get about 50%, so at that particular point in time, you're getting upwards of 50% of the energy that the body has available in order to carry out that function. So it gets a priority. And the priority of that brain is something we're going to come back to later. We talk about different kinds of food mixes in terms of how we can have good cognitive function. So it does get the lion's share of both of those, the oxygen as well as what's going on with the overall fuels. And as a result of that, now most people in here, thank goodness, are old enough to know who that guy is. So you know, what does your brain like to eat in terms of what's going on? So what we're going to be looking at today is a little bit of the bad, the good, the not so ugly. And Taylor, for you, that's Clint Eastwood. So at any rate, this was a good, bad, not ugly. Everybody knows that movie. So we're going to look at a little bit. We're going to start off by looking at the bad. We're going to spend most of our time today looking at the bad. There are things that you're going to be surprised about that you thought were good for you that are bad for you. And there are things that are going to be, what we thought were bad, are going to be good. And there are some things that are kind of not so ugly after all. So we're going to kind of get into that. So I want to start by talking about the concept of food toxins. Now, when I bring up the word food toxins, what does that mean? By the way, I kind of lecture a Socratic kind of method. So I ask a question, people kind of, and I didn't do it at the beginning. I need to make sure I hold all other questions till the end, because I got a lot of stuff to try and get through. But when I ask a question, then I will like to certainly have that answer come back. So when I say food toxins, what do you think about?
Food that doesn't agree with your body.
And that would be one. Food that doesn't agree with your body.
Pesticides.
Pesticides. That's the answer I get most often. Most people think about pesticides and those kind of things are actually part of how and what's processed or what's out there in the environment and those other kind of things. And so really, when you get right down to it, if you take a look at this, that we actually consume, and it says here, you know, some 5,000 to 10,000 different natural food toxins. What does that mean? That means it's the toxin that the plant produces itself. It's not man-made, it's not from the outside, it's not from the environment, it's actually what the plant has that is actually contained within the plant itself. And it's upwards of about 1.5 grams. And then from the standpoint of residual pesticide, we're getting some 0.00009 gram of synthetic pesticide residues as far as our diet is concerned. But yet, what makes the news? It's the arsenic in the rice, and it's the arsenic in the apple juice, and it's, you know, all those kind of things. And ultimately, that's a small percentage. When you get right down to it, 99.9% of the toxins we get as far as our diet is concerned actually come from what's inherently in the plant itself naturally. And while that's now, by the way, I'm not saying go out of your way to eat a bunch of pesticides. That's not what I'm suggesting. And I'm not suggesting that pesticides are not a neurotoxin that we sometimes have to pay attention to. Because sometimes after a lifelong time of eating different kinds of things that have residual pesticides, with my golfers who are out in the golf course all the time and they're exposed to pesticides, we sometimes have to deal with pesticides. Or my farmers who've been spraying that crap forever. You know, that has a tendency. So we had to pay attention to this. I'm not saying it's not there by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, I want to now look at a different side of that, which is the actual food toxins that are produced itself. So up here, Pericles is actually, he's the father of toxicology. This goes back obviously to the ancient Greek days. And he made a statement, he says, all things are poisonous, only the dose permits something not to be poisonous. And so in other words, the poisonous aspect is actually in the dosage. In the dosage of what is there, and not that necessarily all things are going to be toxic. So food toxins are that way, and here's some examples. 7 quarts of water, by the way, this is actually over a short period of time. So 7 quarts of water would be toxic, and these things can actually be lethal. 5 pounds of sugar, that's anything, by the way, over 3 Krispy Kreme donuts is actually equivalent to that. There's a comedian I saw the other day, it was kind of funny. He says that he has a recurrent dream. And it's a wonderful dream, and he dreams that he was allowed to land the conveyor belt at Krispy Kreme and go through the glazing process. So he's just, so if you guys had any dreams now, you can thank me for that. And obviously, you have fun stuff. So these are things that, in small amounts are no big deal, but when you start consuming too much of them, obviously they're toxins. So the idea is that dose makes the toxin is going to be an important aspect as we go through this. So there are some principles of food toxicity, and again, not just the fact of having some pesticides, but it's actually the foods themselves. Animal foods are generally non-toxic. Now, I'm not talking about the antibiotics or the growth hormone or the fact of what they've been exposed to in the environment. But as a general rule, animals do not develop toxins with their own tissues to try and repel something, because for the most part, mammals and those things are fairly high in the food chain, so they don't have inherent toxins that are part of them, unless, of course, they've been exposed environmentally. All plants make toxins. Because plants are stationary, they can't get up and run around, they actually are, they're pretty much the victims of their space, and so therefore insects and other animals are very easy, they're very easy prey, so to speak. So all plants make some level of toxins. Now sometimes, the toxin is enough to ward off the ant or some insect that size, but certainly has a little effect on humans. But sometimes that's not always the case. And you have to be aware of plants eaten by mammals. In other words, if mammals are eating those plants, obviously, and this I'm talking about grazing animals, where there's cattle or deer or something along those lines. And so therefore, a lot of times those particular plant foods that are most toxic are the ones that are in the grasslands, those that are raised out there in crops. And we'll be reviewing some of those and talking about those. So those are the plants that tend to have the greatest degree of toxicity potential because they had to survive over a period of time. And remember that the dose doesn't even make the poison. So this is some concepts we want to do as we go through and start looking at those foods that are toxic to our body. And the dose makes a difference. There's an 88-year-old Chinese woman, and she lapsed into a coma. She couldn't swallow. She really had a difficult time neurologically. And what she had been doing for the last several months is she had been eating nothing but bok choy. Is bok choy toxic? How many people like bok choy? I like bok choy. Sure. But what she was doing is she was eating 2 to 3 pounds a day. And she'd been doing it for several months because she'd heard that bok choy would cure her diabetes. But yet, that much bok choy on an exclusive type basis, 2 or 3 pounds a day, caused her neurological system to almost shut down. And they had to identify what that was, and it wasn't for intervention she would have passed. So that's just one example that is out there. So when we start talking about toxic food groups, this is like Johnny Carson, or Casey Kasem, or I used to count down the top 10, 20 of the week, or whatever, so this is the top 2 toxic. Anyway, this is toxic food group number 1. And this is at the top of the list, and I don't know if there's any particular order to this, but probably pretty close to number 1 being the worst one we have. And it's grains. And when I say grains, notice that I'm picturing wheat there, but I'm using the word grains. And it means all grains. We're going to talk a lot about what that implies. So cereal grains, I mean, they're all over the place. And the cereal grains, if you read this up here, you can see that there's 4 of those are accounting for 70% of the agriculture. If you add 4 more, it ends up being 76%. But the startling thing, this was a little surprise to read this stat when I thought it, is that upwards of 56% of the calories, or 50% of the protein, those 8 cereal grains is what feeds the world. Half the people, that's what they rely on. And as you go through this, you get an idea that also we have a health crisis occurring, not here, but across the world as well, many times because of what's occurring here. But so they're stable, and that's what's allowed the population to grow to great lengths, because indeed these are able to feed them. Now, what these cereal grains have done is they've evolved over time, and one of the things that have made them an appeal from an agricultural type standpoint is that they all tend to have multiple seeds per plant. If you remember looking at the wheat seed there, obviously that one little stalk had 3 or 4 kernels, and that's what made it very exciting for people to be able to begin to cultivate that and to grow that and then to mill that and turn it into flour and those other kind of things. And so that made it something very, very appealing. But what they had to do was, since really about 10,000 years ago when they started being cultivated, is they started to having to develop different kinds of toxins so they could begin to ward off the effects of the mammals that were beginning to feed on them, first in the wild and then less so as they were domesticated. But nonetheless, they had toxins they developed, and the idea was to sabotage the digestive system of the mammals that were eating, whether it was the deer or the wild different kinds of animals that was there, because the intention was that they wanted to be able to pass the seeds through the digestive system. You guys get the idea of passing it through, and it comes out in the feces, and now what we have is we have something that will grow on the other end. So as a way for them to preserve themselves and to pass along literally the seeds by going through the digestive tract. And it's that quality that persists in many of the grains that then make them toxic as they are. So wheat toxins. Everybody knows about this. If there's a buzzword you're seeing now is gluten, gluten-free, right? Gluten-free does not necessarily mean toxin-free, as you'll see as we go through this. But gluten is just actually is a protein that we now know it actually triggers all kinds of autoimmune disease. It promotes cancer, it promotes heart disease, and even neuropathy, where you start having nerves and tingling. So we know that wheat ties directly into that. But gluten is actually made up of two different kinds of proteins. One of them is called a gliadin, and gliadins are actually more toxic proteins than are the glutens themselves. So the gluten is actually a composite of both of those, but both of those are toxic and they act as irritants. And we'll talk about the mechanism by which they begin to affect your body in just a bit. They also have opioids, okay? And this is beginning to come out. There's a book out there called Wheat Belly, where they're talking about the fact that opioids are there to actually make you want to eat it. Now, why would that be good for animals? Why would a plant want an animal to eat it?
Grow fast enough quicker.
That's right. Well, and wait a minute, that's the animal. But what the plant wants, it wants that animal to want the plant, so it will eat it. So it will pass the seed into the feces and more of it grows, you see. So the opioids are there, and that's what makes you, how many people here love Italian bread? Raise your hand, be honest. Yeah, see, people like that because, but part of it is we actually are a little bit addicted to wheat. When I have people go off wheat, they go through the Joneses a bit. They actually get kind of a little bit manic for a day or two because they're used to having that carbohydrate, having that wheat, and people love to have their bread. So the opioids are actually one of the things that causes that. It can even actually been shown to actually cause some forms of schizophrenia, literally, when people are eating wheat. That's the cause of that. And there's another toxin inside wheat as well. It's actually called wheat germ and gluten. And there's wheat germ and gluten. That's probably the worst part of wheat. No one ever talks about that. Because what it does, it really wrecks the GI system. It actually promotes, as we'll see in a few minutes, the gut. It interferes with vitamin D metabolism, which is, most people know now how important that is relative to overall immune system, bone health, the list goes on. So that particular aspect of wheat. So all three of these toxins, the gluten with its two different components, the opioids, and the wheat, gluten is actually working against us when we tend to eat those things. So what's the problem? And I guess that's kind of what you say, well, what's the big deal? I got these things in it. Well, the problem is that the toxins create an immune system response because it's trying to get it out of your gut. How many people here, when they eat wheat, if they've noticed this themselves, how many people feel kind of bloated? Yeah, and that bloat factor is your gut saying, okay, this is not settling too well with me. This, there's something going on here. So what happens is it sets up a situation where the gut is responding because there's a toxin there. Your body actually knows that. Now, if you eat it long enough, you don't pay a lot of attention. There's a lot of things I've noticed that way. Like people who drink Diet Coke, they think it's the best thing since apple pie until I get them off Diet Coke, and then they take a sip of it some weeks later, and they say, how did I ever drink that? But while they were doing it, they were addicted to it, and it tasted fantastic to them because it was actually filling an addiction that they had developed to that. And bread's exactly the same way. So people don't notice it sometimes until they get away from it. They just kind of think that's the natural way to kind of feel. I thought this was very interesting, is that for every gram of wheat fiber that one consumes, they've actually, I don't know who measured this, but somebody had to have this job. They found there was 5.7 grams of fecal weight that came out. Now, it's not just water. I mean, obviously the wheat bran absorbs some water, but what also happened is it means that some of the food was passing through undigested. So for every 1 gram of wheat bran you're using, you're losing about another 4 grams of food. So in other words, it causes a malabsorption because it causes the body to rush through and try and get things moving along. One of the complaints I have of people when they go off wheat is that I'm constipated now. My bowels aren't moving very well. Well, why were they moving before? Because the body was too busy trying to get rid of the stuff they shouldn't have been in there to begin with. So the bowel has to adjust to not having that toxic factor in the gut. And so sometimes the bowel does change in terms of overall motility. And the intestines does become inflamed. And that's all the whole idea of this, is because the toxin gets inflamed, and the inflammation kills the intestinal cells, and it causes leaky gut. Now, those of you who are my patient, have you ever heard of leaky gut before? Okay, it's something that's probably, I mean, if I find that once, I find it 10 times a week. Leaky gut is just everywhere. I had a practitioner in town who says, well, he always finds leaky gut. And I said, yes, because leaky gut is very prevalent, and you'll see as we go through more of this is why, but this is part of the reason why. So what is leaky gut? For those of you who are in the last lecture, you may recognize this, but leaky gut basically is a situation where normally a healthy gut has all the cells side by side. The idea is nothing gets between there. That's a wall. And for lots of different reasons, and these food toxins being one, we start to begin to have problems where we have gaps between the cells. And so when it's side by side, it keeps everything inside the intestine where it belongs. When there's gaps, it literally begins to leak out and get into the bloodstream, which then now triggers the immune system response that we begin to see in terms of inflammation. So leaky gut is associated with so many different kinds of conditions, all the way from different kinds of arthritis and arthralgias, to fibromyalgia, to lupus, to all kinds of autoimmune conditions. This is the basis of which a lot of those things begin to develop. So sometimes the picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is the little bit of an animation we have. And these are bacteria or food particles, either one. This is the inside part of the gut. And then this is kind of a little bit of an idea of what happens. So what happens is that with leaky gut, these things sneak out. The immune system attacks those. It then forms inflammatory cytokines. In an area like the brain, it can be affected by that. We have inflammation. Inflammation is not only the thing that can begin to affect our cognitive function, but it affects everything. In fact, inflammation is the thing that causes us to age most. Premature aging is too much inflammation. The key I want you to tie into here is the foods you eat can either contribute to more inflammation or it can begin to put the fire out. So in terms of going through this, it's about what we're trying to do is to go through it, have all the information about those things that actually create fire. So that is actually leaky gut. What they found is they've surveyed, and I'm sure that more information is coming through, is there's different levels of immune system response to wheat itself. About 83% of the population seems to have some level of inflammation to wheat. So basically, 8 out of 10 people in the room have some issue as far as at least by some inflammation. The answer is the reality is probably more than that. I don't know there's 17% of people who don't have any reaction to it because there's still some toxins there. About 30% of the population develops an antibody to the wheat gluten itself. So now the immune system kicks in at a higher level. So it goes from, and by the way, those 30% are into that 83%. So in other words, there's a smaller segment, but they have a much more dramatic reaction. About 11% develop systemic antibodies to wheat. Now what that means is no longer, it's not just in the gut anymore, it's now out in the entire body, in the entire bloodstream. Anywhere else in the body, we can begin to start having that immune system response occur as far as wheat is concerned. And about 0.4% of the population actually begin to start having autoantibodies, not just the wheat, but because sometimes the similarity of the structure, or because the immune system gets so excited, it now begins to start developing antibodies against its own tissue. And that's where we get into some of the things that we'll talk about here in just a minute. So the health links. Type 1 diabetes is linked to the wheat protein globulin 1. That would be, this is something similar to that 0.4% of the population. Those individuals who have this, and of course, if they're developing type 1 diabetes, where did that come from? Type 1 diabetes just comes because it begins to attack the actual pancreas itself. So the pancreas is attacked, and it begins to eliminate the cells that produce the insulin not there. So wouldn't that be interesting if we found out that diabetes, would you want to sit over there?
Yeah, I'm just waiting.
No. There's room over there. So it'd be interesting to find out that if all the type 1 or a lot of the type 1 diabetes, I've had patients before who were perfectly fine. One time I had a young girl she was a 12-year-old, and she was perfectly great. She had some allergies. We got those allergies fixed, and all of a sudden, overnight, she was type 1 diabetic. Because she got a virus that came out of the blue, that virus attacked her pancreas, and then it created an autoimmune condition, and her pancreas, in a matter of days, was gone. So we know it can happen very quickly with virus, and there was nothing I could do to change it. That's how quick it happened. Unfortunately, I think we can do the same thing. So we have a lot of people walking around, particularly a lot of kids, who have gut issues because of antibiotics and other kinds of things they've been doing. And so subsequently, they're much more susceptible to wheat having an impact. In other words, if you already have leaky gut from too much sugar or antibiotics or those kinds of things, then this come along and just really compounds the problem. Hypothyroidism. How many people know about wheat and Hashimoto's disease? Hashimoto's disease is actually an autoimmune condition of your thyroid, and it's been linked to actually wheat. So one of the first things I do when someone comes in who's having any kind of autoimmune condition of their thyroid is make sure they get off wheat. True of any autoimmune condition, but certainly wheat is at the top of the list because it has a tendency to do that. heart transplant, I didn't know this fact, I kind of ran across this as I was researching this, is that almost all heart transplant patients are celiac, which came first, the chicken or the egg. Likely, they picked the chicken, I'm not sure which is the chicken or which is the egg, but nonetheless, more than likely they had some gut issues and had some wean issues that over time began to have an impact, and whatever reason it targeted their overall heart cells. Lymphomas, there's a link that people that have between 40 and you see between 40 and 100-fold higher incidence of lymphomas, individuals who have issues as far as wheat. So that's obviously lymph cancer in terms of those kinds of issues. And there's a whole host of everything from MS to lupus that have been now showing more and more linked, not just to the issues as far as wheat is concerned, but this whole issue of leaky gut. Remember that wheat causes the leaky gut. And there's some other foods that can do that as well. And then obesity is actually, is part of the overall process of wheat, and it actually triggers insulin resistance. And so we see obesity associated with the fact that we have this toxicity. So those are all things. And then how many people have heard of H. pylori? H. pylori is a bacteria that causes ulcers. The Australian physician, by the way, who discovered that, he promoted that, and when he first said that this is a bacteria that caused ulcers, he almost lost his medical license. They persecuted him and said, "You're nuts, that can't be that." He finally drank a solution that had the H. pylori in it. They really thought he was nuts. And then 4 years later, he got a Nobel Prize. So there you go. Conventional wisdom takes a while to kind of catch up, but now we know that H. pylori, by the way, now the newest theory is that all of us have H. pylori living in our stomach, much like we have mold and yeast in our intestinal tract. It's not overgrown. So therefore, it looks like we not only have H. pylori, and under the right circumstances that H. pylori can overgrow and proliferate, just like the mold and yeast can overgrow and proliferate in the rest of our intestines, and that any given moment, under any given circumstance, we might have some H. pylori overgrowth, just like we can in other parts of the body. China study, how many people read the book? Great book. It's a book that primarily espouses and talks about plant-based diets. Great science, a lot of good information. This is something, as I read the book and I enjoyed the book, but this is some information that kind of got lost here because no one really talks about that. In as much that in different parts of China, the people predominantly ate different kinds of grains. And they started correlating those different regions of China to find out how did this tally up against mortality. And what they're looking at specifically here was overall mortality as far as heart disease was concerned. And so what they started looking at, just looking for correlative factors to see, okay, people died, is there a correlation between this grain and that? So what they found out is there's about a positive 67% correlation with wheat. The individuals in different regions who ate higher levels of wheat, there's about a 67% correlation. They're more likely to die from heart disease. They're actually doing a correlation of about 39% with other grains. So if you're excluding wheat now, the other grains still produce some overall effects. But a very interesting study kind of came out of this, and we'll talk about this later, is that there was actually a negative correlation with white rice. White rice actually improved and lessened the likelihood of you having heart issues. And you'll see why in just a minute. I know I see some frowns already. What? White rice? Are you kidding me?
That's a good one.
So we'll come back to white rice a little bit later. Toxic food group number 2. You should probably do this more dramatically. I should have do like Dave Letterman does it. Here's some drones. Beans, legumes. How many people like beans? Raise your hand. See, what happens is that when you do a plant-based diet, there's nothing wrong with plant-based diets. Plant-based does not mean necessarily exclusively plant. It can, as they evolved into that situation. The thing is that when you start talking about that, your grains and beans are a big part of where you get your protein. But you need to be aware of these factors. So beans and legumes are toxic group number 2. Now, before I get into this, legume toxins. Now, a lot of the legume toxins are handled if they're cooked correctly. If you go through how and what you need to do, which means if you soak the beans for some 8 to 10 hours before you then cook them for 2 or 3 hours, for the most part, a lot of these toxins are denatured. And so therefore, beans are not as harmful as they could be. There's a couple of toxins we'll talk about that are not affected by cooking. But the problem is that where do most people get their beans these days? Cans. Open up the can, pour it in the salad, away we go. How many people think the food companies are taking and soaking their beans for 8 hours and then cooking for 2 or 3? Not likely, because of time factors. So I want to let you know that you can, if you're going to eat beans, you need to make sure that you are indeed cooking them, quote unquote, the old-fashioned way, so that you're actually denaturing a lot of the toxins that are here. Lectins that are inside beans are very similar to the glutens that are inside the wheat. They produce the same kind of toxic reactions to the intestinal tract, and they can also promote leaky gut exactly the same way. And anytime you promote leaky gut, then you still have all the same factors that can begin to happen with that. The legumes also have alpha amylase inhibitors. Amylase is a digestive enzyme that is designed to break down carbohydrates and starches that's produced by the pancreas. And again, remember the goal here of the bean is to keep you from digesting it so it can pass on through and get out of the system. The problem is, of course, when it's cooked, it's not going to germinate anyway, but it doesn't know that, and the toxins are not prepared. If it's not prepared cooked, they're still there. So the amylase inhibitors, so you can't really digest it efficiently. And part of the problem with not digesting it efficiently, it keeps on going downstream. If you can't digest it and absorb it, and it goes on downstream, who gets that? Toilet's one. There's one little thing that gets before that. Bacteria. So there's more for the bacteria to feed on. We're going to talk later about it, but keep that in the back of your head. Is if you can't break it down, you can't absorb it, we get more things downstream that get fed. And those things usually are not things that we want to have fed too much. This also has a phytohemagglutinin. This is a particular thing that's in kidney beans. You know, all the chilies and all those kind of things. This is a pretty good toxin. They found that when they were feeding rats and they were studying this, they found that the gallbladder was actually contracted by 2/3 because of this toxin. Gallbladder disease may be related to this kind of toxin for beans. And that's not why I always relate to gallbladder. You always think about what fatty foods when you talk about gallbladder. But what I found over the years is that any food, if you have leaky gut and you have any of these foods that trigger histamine reactions, like we saw on that slide, you can get your gallbladder inflamed. You can get it upregulated, you can begin to start having some overall issues. So these are all the toxins that you find in beans. And this one is the one that's not destroyed by cooking. In evergreen is an alfalfa sprout and broad beans. Now those are sprouts you see a lot of times on the salad bars. So these are not cooked, these are actually raw, and so there's some inherent of these particular toxins in there. And the real key things here is that this particular toxin actually blocks nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is something that you need for vasodilation. It relaxes the blood vessels so you can get blood vessel flow. Nitrous oxide is important for growth hormone formation. So it does a lot of things, as you see here, for the vascular immune system and the nervous system. And if it's blocked by this particular toxin, then it also impedes the overall effect of that. It interferes with disposal of ammonia. Ammonia is the waste product that occurs when you're having digested your proteins. And so as a result, if you happen to be eating this on your salads thinking you're really making yourself healthy, this thing can begin to block your ability to detoxify the blood and you become more acidic. Or this way your pH begins to get thrown off by accumulation of these waste toxins. It blocks reproduction, probably in a couple of different ways. Anybody else know what nitrous oxide does as far as reproduction? Nitrous oxide is important for vascular. Let's put it this way. That's what.
Vasodilator.
It's vasodilator. So I get that. I'll think of it. Cialis. What's the other one?
Viagra.
Yeah. What that does is it causes nitrous oxide release. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. So anyway, that's part of how it begins to work with that. And also, there's been linked to that particular toxin has been linked to lupus, which is, as you know, an autoimmune condition that has a widespread effect in general. So these are all the things that are in there, and I didn't get a lot into the leaky gut aspect, but realize every single one of these are toxins, the body's trying to get rid of it. So a lot of times when you eat beans, what happens to your gut? You get gas. So what you should do, take some bean oil, right? Because now you know that part of why you get gas, part of why you have that bloat that occurs as far as beans are concerned, is because there are some toxic effects occurring as far as the gut is concerned. And that if you're going to be, and by the way, there are less toxic ways to get your proteins than beans. Less toxic ways to get it than necessarily getting it through wheat. A lot of times this is where my vegetarian friends were always trying to get their proteins here. And we'll talk about that. Toxic food number 3. You guys ready? I need some drum roll. Give me a drum roll, please. Vegetable seeds and oils. Vegetable seeds and oils. Now what we're talking about is any seed and any oil. And because of why. So what makes these things the that they are. And it has to do with the fact that the majority of those oils, the majority of those seeds have a very high concentration of omega-6 fats. Now, most people know about, they've heard about omega-6, they've heard about omega-3, they know that omega-3 is fish or flaxseed oil, and then virtually all other oils are from omega-6. Now, they're both essential fatty acids, which means that you have to get these things from your diet. You have to get omega-6, you have to get omega-3 from your diet, and it doesn't mean that you need a lot of it to get there. We're going to talk about the requirements in just a bit, but that's where they come from. And what happened, and you see also up here that the omega-3s tend to come from green leafy vegetables. Certainly they come from different sea life and those other kind of things. So we get those, and of course fish eat those, and that's why there's a lot of omega-3 in fish oil. Flaxseed, again, that seed is produced, and it does produce a lot of omega-3. It has a higher concentration. That may be one exception to the seed concept. But for the most part, all the other seeds have high levels of omega-6. And back in the 1950s and later in the 70s, it was espoused that corn oil was one of the first ones. Corn oil was good for you. Well, what were people using back before corn oil? Crisco. What the hell is Crisco? I'm used to always cooking Crisco. I have no idea to this day what Crisco is. I don't know if I know. Anyway, the thing is that corn oil came along, and so it was touted as being healthy. It was better, and it probably was better than Crisco and lard, whatever that is, or maybe not. But nonetheless, it was expounded as being healthy. What else came along about that time? What were the people eating butter back then, or what did they do?
Margarine.
Margarine. See, that was my first lecture on trans fats. I say stay away from margarine. Now, we got rid of the trans fats, but we haven't gotten rid of the concept that omega-6 fats or that seed oils are good for us. So you're going to look at your packages. Anywhere you're going to look, you're going to find soybean oil, safflower oil, sesame seed oil. You're going to find all of them because they're loaded with omega-6s. And this next statement, and it talks about how in the 50s and 70s it was promoted. One, because it's cheap. It's cheap to grow these things and to extract the oil. It's not as cheap to get the omega-3s. So where omega-6s are everywhere, they're ubiquitous in our diet. And the problem is they're probably one of the most inflammatory and unhealthful substances we can consume. And this was a statement made in one of the papers I read where it basically says that the omega-6 and the introduction of that at high levels is probably one of the, if not the most important aspect of our obesity epidemic. That's a bold statement. Is obesity a problem in the United States?
Yes.
Yeah. And just last week, the American Medical Association or somebody decided to declare it a disease. Who in here thinks that this is a good idea? They should declare it as a disease.
The insurance will take care of it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I got to pay.
paralyze it. See, here's how things begin to happen. The insurance will take care of it. The American Medical Association says it's now a disease. Now we'll have a standard of care. And if you do anything other than the standard of care to help obesity, now you're practicing outside the scope. So what that is now we're going to try to begin in more control relative to obesity. It's a whole bag of work, yeah.
But it also takes away the responsibility of the person.
It does that, yeah. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. Yeah, it's not omega-6. So
palm oil as well.
So what's the problem with omega-6s? There's really two major aspects that begin to make omega-6s being a problem. First, it reacts quickly with oxygen. So, which means that it oxidizes very quickly and therefore promotes inflammation. It is pro-inflammatory, and we already talked about earlier on that inflammation is one of the things that we want to try and avoid at all costs as much as we possibly can. So the fact that it reacts quickly, it promotes inflammation. And it gets into the cell walls, the membranes of our cell walls. And this is a little diagram here. All those little round things are all fat. Every single cell of your body, the membrane is made from fat. Good fat makes good membranes. Bad fat makes bad membranes. And unfortunately, if it's mixed in and you're not even aware, if you're looking at your salad dressing when you get home, guess what it's got in it? Omega-6. I was shopping somewhere and they gave me a little taste of some seaweed. I said, yeah, that's pretty good. And I said, well, why am I getting some of that? I picked up the package, looked at it, and said, holy crap. It wasn't just seaweed, it was like sashimi, it had some whatever, I don't know whatever they had in it, but they had prepared it with all these omega-6 fats. So, you really, when it comes to omega-6, I'm going to encourage you to remove this scourge from your life because it'll make a tremendous difference in terms of how things are going. Yeah.
I think when you told the last time, then I wrote it down wrong because we were always using just the omega-3 fish oil, And I switched from that to the triple omega to include the 3, 6, and 9. So I think I did the wrong thing then.
And you may very well have it. And quite frankly, some of this stuff since the last lecture, if you had asked me 3 or 4 months ago about this, another concept we're going to have underneath carbohydrates, I wouldn't have been on board with it. Because part of it is this, and this is a never-ending quest to be able to try and get to what is the latest scientific information. You know, what's out there. And so it is, you know, this is still a bouncing ball a bit. You know, so
better than go back to just the 3 and not check.
and by the time we're done here a little bit, you may even question that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So what's the problems with excessive omega-6? First of all, liver disease. And this is true, and this is just your question you just had, both omega-3 and omega-6 actually, if taken in high quantities or consumed in high quantities, can actually affect the liver. Because the liver, it begins to accumulate these and begins to start adding to the overall fatty liver situation. If you happen to be consuming fructose and or alcohol into any large degree as well, it's really compounded. So what happens is because it promotes inflammation and how it's processed begins to affect the liver in big ways, which we'll talk about. Atherosclerosis, it contributes to problems with that because of the inflammation. Anytime you have inflammation, you have more free radicals, you have more oxidation, and this stands for, most people know what LDLs are, but the ox in front of it is actually oxidized LDLs. So it's the part that, and this is the really bad cholesterol. LDLs are the smaller particles, but when you oxidize them down, those are the things that promote more inflammation and can indeed promote clotting as far as the blood is concerned. So we know that the omega-6s are causing that. The obesity, this gets back to the obesity epidemic. How does insulin work? And so just briefly, if we have a cell membrane, here comes the hormone, it attaches there and it's supposed to tell that cell to let sugar come inside. If that cell is not functioning correctly, if there's inflammation in the cell because there's too much omega-6, is that insulin going to work correctly? And the answer is no. We'll also find that the omega-6 fats also will have a tendency to cause the adipocytes to actually take on more fat cells as well. A lot more allergies and asthma related to this because the whole immune system is upregulated in a very, very big way. Mental illness, high omega-6 is associated with depression, higher rates of violence. Because again, why? Magic word, inflammation. Bowel disorders about 2.5 more times ulcerative colitis because again, the oils in the gut. And the cancer, rats that were fed omega-6 has 4 times more metastasis. In other words, if you had cancer, there's about 4 more times likely if you have high levels of omega-6 that's going to spread to other areas. Again, because the whole immune system is beginning to be compromised.
What would be an excess of omega-6?
Isn't that funny? You asked that question. Look up there.
Yeah.
So how much do we need? Omega-6 needs are about 1 to 2% of calories. Now, because the reason I do it that way is because what you eat, how much I eat is going to be different. About 1 to 2%. That's not very much. Now, I guess we're going to go a little bit further. If you have omega-3 fats, and you actually lowers it down to where you only need about 0.3%. Okay. Now, what I mean by if you have omega-3 fats, and this is where we get into your question about actually do we need fish oil. Now, there are times, by the way, and I need to qualify this. If you've got major clotting issues, if you had heart issues, you've got things we need to do therapeutically, I will sometimes give fish oil. But for the most part, for the average individual, if they will eat about 1 serving of salmon a week, it gives them, because you can store omega-3s, so that will give you about what you need as far as omega-3 fats. And you don't need to go around doing a tremendous amount. So if you're going to do that, you need next to no omega-6 in your diet. You almost can't avoid getting at least 0.3 milligrams a day. Yeah?
But you don't want farmers.
Excuse me?
You don't want the farmers.
No, you want to try and get the wild salmon as much as you can, but even that still has omega-3s in it. There are other problems. It's like, do we have free-range cows? Those are best. You can't always get that. There's just some value still in regular beef. The answer is yes. So it doesn't have as much. But the key is this. What's too much is kind of the question. Is over 4% of calories, it becomes toxic. And every one of these foods we want to try and get to is their optimal levels. Now, how much wheat can we have? That's not even giving you it. There's none. How many beans should you have? And the answer is none. Now, by the way, the dose makes the poison. So you can. What if you have one little piece of Italian bread when you go there to Italian? You're going to keel over? The answer is no. But the idea is that you want to do that. But now we do need some omega-6 fats, and so this begins to give you some criteria. And every one of these areas I'm trying to go through and say, okay, what's the toxic level, and what's kind of the necessary level for us to get to? Toxic group number 4, fructose.
Yeah, we have that.
Fructose. And we got a honey picture there, we got a fruit picture there, and that's not by accident. You really, when you get to, and we're talking more about sugars, and the sugar, the ones we're talking about in a lot of people's diets, but probably less in yours because you're interested, you're here, is sugar and high fructose corn syrup. You know, aside from high fructose corn syrup having tons of heavy metals, obviously there's lots of other issues, and part of it's inherent in here. The sugars here are composed of 2 different sugars, and that's glucose and fructose. Now, as we find and go through, is glucose a good sugar or a bad sugar? People don't know. Glucose is a good sugar. That's what you get measured. That's what fuels your body. Glucose is what goes inside your cell, and that's what actually powers up and allows the cell to make ATP, which is the real energy inside your cell. So you want glucose. Anybody ever had the fructose measured in the blood? You never will. Because 100% of the fructose that's absorbed goes to the liver and is converted instantly to the liver. Not 1 ounce of fructose can make it to the peripheral bloodstream. And it's the metabolism of the liver that comes about that can begin to make it a problem. So what we have is that when you start having fructose, again, now we have, and we'll talk about the metabolic effects of this in just a bit, but what they found is that in rat experiments, they had high fructose consumption. When I say high fructose, what am I talking about? Am I talking about fruits? The answer is yes. I am talking about fruits as well. Not just high fructose corn syrup and not just sucrose. I am talking about fruits. We also have insulin resistance, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure. These are all things. These are this is what's killing most of America. And it's related a lot to what goes on. See, if we look back to prior to Neolithic times we started cultivating, this is back 10,000 years ago. Do you think back then we had fruits every day?
No.
We have them now because we go to the grocery store. Even 50 years ago, did we have them every day?
No.
No, because unless you lived in an area where there were more, unless you can them or put them up. Because certainly if you go back 75 years ago, nowadays we have all this stuff available and we're eating it in high quantities. And therein lies why we begin to start having more and more of these conditions develop. Blood lipids, this is a study that's actually done on humans. What they did is they shifted the calories away from glucose. They actually had the person just 25% more fructose. And what they had is all these things, all the parameters we know about. The LDLs went up, the triglycerides went up, and in the abdominal fat actually was 4-fold compared to baseline. They actually put weight on around the middle. This is just by replacing fructose. So the thing is, if you see in a powdered protein or thing, you have fructose is flavored with that. Is that a natural sugar?
No.
Yes. Is it good for you? Now you know it's not. So what's the problem with this? Is it promotes metabolic syndrome and diabetes and fatty liver. And this is a mechanism called endotoxemia. I told you earlier to remember about beans. When it starts making it on downstream, it starts feeding the bad bacteria. Endotoxemia actually is a process where inside your own body you produce toxins. And you produce them because of the bacteria. You feed the bacteria in their cell walls, and when they break down and die, there's a tremendous amount of toxins released. The more bacteria you have, the more toxic effects you have, the more inflammation you have, and the sicker you are. So this idea of endotoxemia comes from basically microbial overgrowth inside the intestinal tract. And it causes malabsorption, much like the leaky gut we talked about, because it promotes inflammation there. So yet another cause of leaky gut. A lot of times people ask me what causes leaky gut. I always tell them antibiotics and alcohol and medication and stress. But now you can add to the list wheat and beans and now too much sugar and endotoxemia, because you feed the bacteria too much with the overall fruits. So it causes the inflammation. It also causes adipose cells. See, your fat cells will put on more fat if you're inflamed. So if you have a lot of toxins floating around your body, people always talk about getting detoxified. If you got a lot of toxins floating around, you'll actually put on weight. And one of the theories is that it actually will act as a depot to store toxins, but part of the process, they're stimulated to put on more fat because of the inflammation, because of the circulating toxins. that are coming from you. I'm not talking about the pesticides and chemicals and those things in the environment. That just adds to the overall list. These are coming from you inside your gut. Fructose actually causes leptin resistance. Leptin is a hormone produced that actually helps regulate your fat. It actually helps release of fat, and it begins to cause leptin resistance so that the body's not responding to it, so obesity begins to change. If you see my pace picking up, it's because I'm probably about 3/4 way through, and I suppose I've got 10 more minutes. I will say this, I'm going to keep on going until I'm done, because I've worked too long to not do it. If anybody has to leave, let me know, but I'm just going to give you a heads up that we're going to run over on this. It also causes fatty liver disease, and this is important to get, because when fructose is absorbed, I already mentioned to you, you won't find it in the blood because 100% goes to your liver, and it's broken down some into glucose, but a fair amount of fructose is turned into fat, and it stays right there in the liver. Is a fatty liver a good thing?
No.
The answer is no. And the endotoxins are higher, and this was interesting because they fed rats obviously fructose, they fed them regular food, and there's higher levels of endotoxemia in those overall mice, so it's been confirmed. And the omega-6 fats also induce this. So if you're having those seed oils and you're also having fructose, I mean, one of the worst disasters, I mentioned Krispy Kreme. You want to talk about a walking disaster. We've got it's made from wheat. It's got sugar. It's got the omega-6 fats in them to high levels. Get the idea? So I guess the only thing worse is put a little beans on top of it. The use of fructose also causes gout. How many people here know about gout? A lot of people suffer from gout. And everybody's talking about, well, don't drink wine, and don't have fried foods, and don't eat cheese, but they didn't talk about fructose, did they? What happens is that fructose is actually, to metabolize fructose, and this is all that takes place in your liver, is it requires phosphate from your ATP. ATP is adenine triphosphate. That's the energy your body produces. So it uses the phosphate, which means that we have the adenosine left over. So the A part of the ATP is left over. The body has to figure out, what do I do with this excess because it's not in balance. So it's got to take that protein. It converts that into uric acid. Okay, and the uric acid then is now the beginning of the process. Most people know that's associated with that. Well, it's released into the blood, and part of the problem is that humans, dogs, and apes were the only species that lack an enzyme that can break down uric acid. So if you have gout and you're eating a lot of wheat and a lot of fruit because you're going to try and alkalize your body, you're going to get rid of this gout, what are you doing? Loading it up. So that's the overall problem. Of course, these crystals go out into the joints and cause gout. So if you have a friend who has gout, my suggestion is that they back off on their consumption of fructose, and then we see an improvement there as well. How much fruit? Now somebody will say, how much fructose can I have? It's been estimated, and again, this is getting to level, about 25 grams of fructose a day, and we'll talk about how it's going to be mixed in, but about 25 grams a day and no more than 10 grams per meal. So an apple, a medium-sized apple, has about 11 grams of fructose. So that means you can have about 2 to 2.5 servings, I'll just say 2 to 3 servings of fruit a day. If you're eating more than that, you're loading up on fructose and all the problems we just talked about. So all my friends who are doing their blending and they're putting in their berries and their banana, they're putting all that stuff in there, is that working?
Yeah.
Or they're loading up fructose, and what are they going to give themselves? Liver, inflammation.
What about the juicing?
Same thing. Problem with juicing, I mean, there's times to do all kinds of stuff. I'm not a fan of, not an opponent to juicing, but it can't be a way of life. I mean, it certainly can be anything, but the thing is that, and when you juice, you also get the fiber. A lot of protein, everybody talks about getting from juicing, it's in the fiber, they throw it away, and now you do have all the nutrients, don't get me wrong. If you got cancer, there's lots of good programs out there who have been used. I mean, the part of juicing is a big part of that. But again, those are extreme health issues. I'm trying to hit a broader population. This is lifestyle stuff that you can pay attention to.
Well, they say that blueberry juice is good for the brain if you have dementia or...
Well, first of all, it's an antioxidant. And again, we're trying to stay on track, but it's an antioxidant. Is an antioxidant good for you? Of course it is. But it may be better if you eat a few blueberries because of all the other fiber and other parts of it as opposed to drinking the juice. I always ask people, how many oranges would you eat at once? One. And how many oranges does it take to make orange juice? More than one. Okay. Same with carrots. We'll talk about that. All right, now we're finally we just got finished covering the bad. Now we're going to get to the good. Or we're talking about a different kind of good. These are the carbohydrates. And it's not the kind of carbohydrates that everybody's thinking about. When you have plants, and this is where we're talking about the carbohydrates coming from, they actually store the energy in what, two ways. They either store it as a starch, or they store it as sugar. That's how it's stored in plants. That's where they come from. And the starches that are in these plants digest directly into glucose. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That's good.
It's a good thing. Glucose is the building that we need. We need to have glucose because that's what is used for building materials in other parts of the body, because you can use it to do a lot of different things in the body, and it's also the fuel that runs the body. So starches digest right into that. We already know, by the way, what do sugars digest into? A lot of times they go into fructose. That's the part of the situation. So many of the forms of sugar metabolize into glucose and also to fructose. So do you think we want more of those or less of those that do that? We want less of those that have a situation where they go both into fructose, because we know that fructose is one of those things that promotes inflammation. So what all of a sudden we begin to have occurring, and we already talked about how fructose is a worthless nutrient because it's converted not only into glucose but glycogen, and the biggest issue is it goes into lactate, into fat. And of course glucose has many uses in the body. But carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, and the type of carbohydrates I'm talking about is starch. How many people in here think eating starch is a good idea? See, it's gotten vilified. There's a new book out that Dr. I'll think of his name in a second, but anyway, he wrote it out in California. McDougall, Dr. John McDougall, was a big plant-based advocate, and he wrote a book out called Starch Solution. Because what's being identified is that the starch that you have in your body, your brain actually functions better in a certain amount of starch because it goes directly into glucose. So about 85% should have glucose and about 50% glucose. Therefore, starches are something that we should get some consideration to. And we're going to talk about some research that's been done that shows how and why starches are something that we have evolved to need because it goes right into glucose. And the glucose is what can begin to fuel the body, and how it begins to help with appetite, how it begins to actually help with weight loss, not induce it. So starches should be eaten with fat, vinegar, and vegetables. So we're going to talk about safe starches in just a bit. So somebody in here is about ready to be happy because it now begins to liberate a couple of things that you've been restricting yourself from. And of course, we want to avoid sugars if we can, to a large degree, if we can. But I listed up here 3 sugars that go specifically into glucose. They metabolize only into glucose. Those are the rice syrup, the tapioca that you see there, and also the dextrose powder. Those do not have a fructose component. They go right into glucose. And so therefore, if you find those, you can use those as sweeteners. And that then is something you can avoid the pitfalls of the other ones. And the non-starchy vegetables are unlimited. From a dietary standpoint, anything that's non-starchy, which means your cauliflower, your broccoli, your kale, your spinach, whatever, all those things, you eat those, and they don't factor in this discussion we're going to have about how much carbs you have. The only carbs we're going to be talking about in terms of limitations in a minute is going to be the starchy carbs and the sugary vegetables like the carrots and the beets and your fruits. We'll talk about the calorie restrictions here, because you don't want to have a tremendous amount. If you go on and eat too much in the way of starchy foods, then you will have a problem. Because even then, remember, the dose makes the poison. So if you eat too many starches, you will run into all the problems. So the problems that people are having with starches, they were consuming above the toxic limit that created a negative effect in the body. But there's an ideal effect that has your brain working better and has your metabolism working better, and that's what this is about. So what are safe starches? White rice. It's not a misprint. Not the brown rice. White rice actually has a hull on it, and it's that hull so imagine that the rice wants to go through your digestive system. You get rid of the outside protective coating. What do you have left? You've got the starch that can be metabolized 100% into glucose. Now, how much should we have? We'll talk about that momentarily. White potato. Remember I said earlier that your starches should be eaten with what? Fat. Okay, we're going to talk about fats in a moment. But yes, that means butter. And it also means if you want to put vinegar on there, because vinegars and acids begin to help with that. Sweet potatoes. butternut squash, plantains. Those are all quote-unquote safe starches because they metabolize directly and they have a much higher degree of glucose and a lot less in the way of fructose. So you can probably look up other vegetables to look at their fructose-glucose combinations, and maybe you can find other ones as well. There's one I saw called taro. How many people in here eat taro? How many people in Hawaii? How many people eat poi? Anyway, that's what that's made from. I don't ever eat this, so therefore, but it's safe if you want to eat poi. Go right ahead. So you got to eat about 1 pound a day. What that means is about 1 fist size full about 4 times a day. Quantitatively, that then allows you to want to gain weight.
Are those things there?
Excuse me?
Of that listing there?
Yep. So you can have white rice, you can have potatoes, you can have sweet potatoes, and all of those things. And what this glucose will do is it'll begin to start helping your body metabolize more efficiently. It's going to actually improve cognitive function. The brain needs the right kind of sugar. Your body needs the right kind of fuel. Now, if you start going over this amount, then you're going to have problems. Stick with this, and then we'll talk about that. But this is the size of the starches. Now, remember, if you're going to eat beets or you're going to eat carrots or you're going to eat those other kind of things, then they're all within a certain aspect of this. They're all grouped together. And then, of course, I just said that you're just combined with the fruit and sugary vegetables. So we want to make sure so overall, we'll kind of get a summary at the very end. So the thing is, you're using some starches, that's going to fuel your body. That's contrary to anything you guys have heard. That's contrary to what I've been talking about for the last probably 10 years. But I'm letting you know, it's leading edge stuff you're going to hear more and more about in the next 4 or 5 years because of what it has. And we'll talk about that as well. Proteins. Dietary proteins were used in really 2 ways, and actually it's going to be used to make more human proteins, which are like muscles, ligaments, tendons, muscles, hair. We are protein. Our body needs and utilizes protein. But it also can be converted into glucose. So protein in your diet can be used to make glucose when there's not enough carbohydrate available. So your body will actually and can actually do that. The problem is, by the way, you can do that if you don't eat. If your body needs glucose and you're not eating, where's it come from? And I always tell people, if you don't eat correctly, they might as well reach down and take a bite out of their leg, because the body will, through a process called gluconeogenesis, mobilize your proteins to go to the liver to be converted to glucose. You can convert protein in your body into glucose. You don't want to break your body down to do that. You want to get it through your foods. So your proteins in your diet can be converted if you're not eating enough in the way of this. Now, some things were, this was how much protein do we need? There's an experiment with rats, and this was very kind of an interesting experiment because it applies to humans. And what they found is that when there's an adequate amount of carbohydrates, and it talks about how many grams that was for the rats, they would eat, but they would stop eating as soon as they hit about 4.6 to 4.9 grams of protein. As soon as they ate enough to get to that 4.6, they stopped eating, as long as there was enough carbohydrate that was there. But what they also found out that if for some reason there was a scarcity of carbohydrate, they would eat way beyond what they normally did in order to get more protein. Why? So they can convert it into and make up for the carbohydrate that was not there. And what that translates into is that obviously you're getting a lot more calories, aren't they? In order to try and meet and get the balance. So on some level, somehow the rats knew exactly what they should be doing. And so they seem to know exactly how much to meet both their needs of carbohydrate and to meet their needs also as far as protein is concerned. And as it turns out, it also applies to humans. On some level, we know what's going on. And as it turns out, we want a particular amount of protein, a particular amount of carbohydrate, and that's where this whole concept of carbohydrate comes into play along with protein. There's an interplay that goes back and forth between the two. If you don't eat enough carbohydrate, and you want to lose weight, you want to avoid the starches, the rest of the body, if it doesn't think it has enough energy, will develop insulin resistance. It could be momentarily. It will not use the energy on the cellular basis because it wants to save it all for the liver to take to the brain. Remember how I talked about the brain has most of the energy? So your body won't use it. If it doesn't use it, you get insulin resistance. You don't move your fat. If you don't, and that's why sometimes when I've constructed diets before, I always put some carbohydrate starch on there because it keeps your thyroid working, keeps your metabolism working, and stops it from stopping the rest of your body from losing weight. And this is probably the most important thing, is the protein is the dominant determinant of appetite. Making sure you have adequate protein to be able to supply the needs will then determine and shut off your hunger response. If you don't have enough protein, you will find yourself still eating to try and meet those protein needs. So how much protein we need is the question. The optimum protein intake is achieved by eating about 8 to 16 ounces of meat, fish, and eggs. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate about plant-based diets, because there are protein in plant-based diets and so forth. It's not as readily available, it's bound up with the fiber, there's a lot of different issues and so forth. But when you get right down to it, when I was looking at the China study, which I love the book, they talked about 10% of your diet being animal protein that can control cancer. And so there's some data that's there as well. And what this boils down to is about 200 to 600 calories in protein, or about 15% of your diet is going to be protein. As you start getting above certain levels, and that's what we want to talk about, more protein is needed, by the way, if you're actually on a low carb. If you're on a low carb, why do you need more protein? Not enough there. And so therefore it's advisable then to do that. Or if you're an athlete in training, which obviously you're burning up more energy. So this is the average person who's doing maybe the average stuff. But if you're working hard and exercising hard, you may need a little bit more than what's up here. The lower protein intake actually promotes longevity. Higher protein promotes strength. The key is to find, what's kind of the minimum protein that keeps you fit and shape, and also keeps you numb, if you will. The body. This is where we get into how much. The body can't remove the ammonia if the protein intake is at 230 grams per day. That's about 920 calories. Now, I have some individuals who think that more protein is good, and they're eating that much. They're getting toxins as things can be. So too much protein is not a good thing. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that if the ammonia that's produced above 600 calories, and that's why you see the limit up there is 600. You start getting into over 600 calories of protein a day, you begin to start accumulating ammonia that's actually as toxic as far as the body is concerned. And that would be about 150 to 200 grams of protein. So again, about 15% is your target. If you're trying to lose weight, about 15% is still pretty good. So that's your target as far as protein is concerned. So I asked earlier about.
So the protein diet produces ammonia. It's one of the worst types of diet there is.
Yeah, it's too much. I mean, first of all, there's lots of things that happen with Atkins and those kind of things, but high level protein is something that produces a toxic effect. Any extreme can produce a toxic effect. All right, here we are. Oh, but I guess you guys got that right. You got that was butter. That's why I asked about coconut oil. So that's butter and coconut oil. So now we're going to talk about fats, and that's probably one of the misunderstood. If all the rest of this stuff's not been misunderstood enough, now we're going to talk about fats, and then because everybody thought, well, fat-free is good, right? No, not at all. And so if you are protein, the next thing you are next is fat, because every cell of your body is fat. Your brain is fat. So you have to have the right fats in order to be able to actually utilize this, and this is where this comes into play. What's interesting about the overall fats is that we're going to talk about saturated and monounsaturated fats. Right? These are fats that have basically no toxic effects. They have not found in large quantities. You can eat as much of these things as you want. If anything, they actually help provide energy as far as the body is concerned. And that's the next point, is that they're the core structure of all of our fats, that make up 70 to 80% of the fatty acids of our cells. They are the structures that make your cells. So if you are what you eat, you want to be saturated or monounsaturated fats. You don't want to be omega-6 fats. You don't want them in your cell membrane short-circuiting the ability. You don't want those other ones in your body making inflammation. These will help quell inflammation, and these will help build the structure, not just of your neurons and your cells, but also your muscles and everything else. And this is something that probably people don't really know. How many people here think you get all your energy in your body from glucose, from sugar? If your sugar is low. The reality is that most of our energy, even now, comes from fat. The bacteria take a lot of your food and they digest it and they make short-chain fatty acids. That's fat, but they're saturated. Your body then takes that and it goes to the cell. Your cells and your brain especially would rather burn fat than it would burn glucose. And it's much more efficient, there's a lot less traffic. So we actually want fat in our diet to be able to do that. And it's the safest, most beneficial source of marginal calories. What does that mean? That means that if we're on a diet, and here we are, we got 600 grams of carbohydrate, 600 calories of carbohydrate, we got 600 calories of protein, and we got a little bit of fruity vegetables thrown in here. How do we get the rest of our calories? And the answer is you get it by adding this fat, if you need to add fat to be able to support that. So you can use these fats, butter, you can use the olive oil, not so much, but the coconut oil actually is a fantastic oil that you can use, and it's out there. And you'll hear more and more about that. You probably already have. You use it for cooking. It actually is the kind of fat that you can literally try and strive for eating a lot more of. So what are the health benefits?
Can I ask just a question?
Sure.
So you're saying olive oil, not really?
You can have some olive oil. Olive oil is still a safe fat. It's not as good as butter. It's not as good as that. It still has some monosaturation effects to it.
Not as good in what respect, but it won't give
It
as
still,
much
coming from olive, still has some of the other mixture of a different kind of oil in it.
Okay.
Coconut oil by far and away is better, and good old-fashioned butter. Now, by the way, should you get organic butter if you can? Of course you should. Raw organic's even better, but you're not going to be able to find that too easy. What's the health benefits? This is a large study. They did this in Japan. They took some 58,000 people. They followed them for some 14 years, and there's the results they had up there. What they found is that, by the way, when they started, they were aged 40 to 79. There's a 31% reduction in mortality from stroke. These are people who had high levels of the monounsaturated and the saturated fats. 18% reduction in mortality from cardiovascular disease. So, in other words, when these individuals were eating higher levels, that there were some protective factors, because what's the number one killer in the United States? Cardiovascular disease and stroke. Right behind that is cancer, and we're finding cancer is an inflammatory process as well. This is for building muscle. Some of you want to know these questions. What's the best way? About 30% carbs, about 18% protein, about 52% fat. Some people want to who are my bodybuilders. So you got a little bit more protein there, right? But notice how much is fat. But now what kind of fat? This kind of fat. By the way, your muscle is not just protein. Your muscle and your muscle bulk is actually a fair percentage of it is fat. When your body starts needing more energy, it'll pull fat from your muscle, not just protein out.
Think about taking a teaspoon of coconut oil daily.
More than that. You'll see here in a minute. Increased, and by the way, this is for us guys. This will increase your testosterone, your growth hormone. And probably for you gals too, because one of your sex steroids are actually based on fat, based on cholesterol. If we're consuming enough good fats, then the body now has enough. We don't know this, somebody asked me this question today. If we're eating enough of these good fats, do you think I would need female hormones? And the answer is no one ever done that study. We do know it raises testosterone. If guys eat enough of these good fats, do we hit andropause? Do our testosterone drop off when we're 40 and 50? The answer is we don't know. No one's done that study. And we're playing around with it. Let me try and get through this, then if you say your guys, I guess you're going. Go ahead, one more question.
Just quickly on the
Yeah.
protein, when you say 52% fat and 18% protein, do I look at the fat and the protein as part of the 52%? In other words, if there's 12 grams of fat in the hamburger, is that part of the 52%?
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of an inclusive deal. So I'm going to put a word about ketogenic diet. We're kind of winding down, so we're kind of getting close to the line, and open it up for questions for it. The ketogenic diet is something that's beneficial for many neurological conditions. Whether it's autism or Alzheimer's, the nervous system responds well because, remember I told you, ketones are fat bodies the body burns very efficiently. And the ketosis diet also has got a lot of these other things that are inflammatory in nature away, so the nervous system can settle down. Whether it's autism or that spectrum or Alzheimer's, there's an inflammatory process if they're eating all this other crap that we've talked about. So we might be surprised what we can do in terms of any kind of mental function or body function if we pay attention to that. So ketone diet, by the way, what this means is you're having a little bit more fat and a little bit less in the way of carbs. Okay, that's what it boils down to. So you consume at least 200 carb, and this is from the safe starches. So we were talking about 6 earlier, now we need at least 200. You still want 200 in there, even if you're trying to do a ketogenic diet, because you still need a little bit of that starch converting to glucose. It still will help drive that, so you don't want to do it exclusively. And one of my staff members at the office, she's doing a ketosis diet, and she's not doing any of the starches whatsoever. she's beginning to crash a bit energetically. She's beginning to get hungry all of a sudden because of this. She's not adding that to the mix. So we had her add that in a little bit. We also had her add her protein in a little bit. You have to eliminate fructose. I mean, totally. If you're going to go into ketosis, no fruit. And you're avoiding any sugar that converts into fruit, period. Because what that does is it runs the ATP from the liver, and the liver has to be able to manufacture all the energy for you as you're going through this. And that's what makes the ketones that your body can use.
Are you eliminating vegetables that turn into sugar too?
Yes. Yeah, you would.
Corn.
Yeah. So pretty much what you're going to do is just 200 calories, that's it. Now, if you have some mix in there, you say corn? The whole corn. What's corn?
I don't eat corn.
Corn's a grain. Don't eat grains. And no grain. I mean, no corn.
The carrots are.
You're still going to eat sufficient calories to eat to get up to 600 calories. Remember, we don't want more than 600 grams of protein, 600 calories of protein. So you're going to still eat your protein to get up to that much in the way of calories from protein. But what you're going to do, and sometimes you need more protein to help with that process. In certain cases, you can actually supplement with branch-chain amino acids. You can use, this is one place you might use a supplement if you need to. In our case, we've got MAP in the office. It's a protein. The amino acids are extracted from peas. It doesn't have the same toxicity factor, obviously, so we use that. And you can use, but you use any branch-chain amino acid. You can get 500 calories, up to 1,500 calories from, and that's the oil. So you're talking about a lot more than just a teaspoon. Now, a lot of people would benefit, by the way, from probably having a good tablespoon, if not 2 tablespoons of oil a day. Coconut oil. And MCT, by the way, is what does it call stand for? Medium chain tri something other. I forget what it actually stands for. Anyway, it's the monounsaturated fat that's in coconut oil. And then this is something that's kind of interesting, is that you might want to give some consideration to eating within an 8-hour window and doing a 16-hour fast and only have the coconut oil during that time. I've been employing that method, and it's kind of interesting. And I'll try to make this short because I'm way over. What happens with that is that when you're eating within that window, that 16-hour fast triggers a thing called autophagia. Autophagia is not something where you break down your muscle. What it does is it means it triggers this thing inside the cell where the cell starts eating up excess fibrinogen and other kinds of waste proteins are inside the cell. By relieving the body of that, you have a situation where you reduce inflammation. So there's some case to be made. So an example, a lot of times what I'll do is and for me to have skipped breakfast to try this out, it was like pulling teeth. So because I love breakfast. So now what I do is I have breakfast for lunch. So what I do is I don't eat breakfast. I have eaten the night before, I go all the way to noon, I eat dinner time, and that's it. And I'm not hungry. My energy is more sustained, and it's something you might want to go. So it tends to create a ketogenic effect whether you get into all the rest of this or not. It's something you might want to try. And vitamin C and glutathione supplements, you need to add those to the mix as well. Yes, I'm too gappy today. So I think, eat food, no shakes. Everybody wants to have protein shakes. That is convenient, it's easy, those other kind of things, but there's nothing that's really going to substitute for real food. And so that's kind of, and this is again about ketone. And so that's where this plays in. And so for yourself, it really helps reduce the inflammation. Individuals who do have autism, who do have Alzheimer's, they benefit very much from increased ketones. And so we end up with about 20 to 30% carbohydrates in a diet. By the way, when I say carbohydrates, I'm not talking about the free vegetables. I'm talking about the starches and the fruits and the sweet vegetables and the sugary vegetables. Protein, about 10 to 20%. We talked about 15% is a good range. Fat plus fiber is about 50 to 70%. And what kind of fat? You guys know. Polyunsaturated fats. Now, that's probably an overestimate. Remember we said above 4% is toxic. We probably do not need much in the way of the omega-6. So most of that polyunsaturated is going to be what? Omega-3 as your salmon for the week. Okay? You eat 1 round of salmon, you got made. And fiber about 1 to 3%. If you eat any other kind of vegetables, you're going to get that just fine. So these are kind of the general things that you try and shoot for. The biggest takeaway messages today is going to be about the wheat, about the legumes. Those are surprises for a lot of people. It goes against what macrobiotics talks about and plant-based diet. So, but again, stay tuned. You'll hear more about that as time goes along. And that's our class. Now, tonight, before I conclude, the little pink thing here, for those of you who want to come see me as a new patient, we have an offer, and there it is. So if you decide to take advantage of that, make sure you do it for, what is it, July 3rd? I'm glad to help you. Obviously, what we do there is we treat, as well as myself or Dr. Minkoff or our nurse practitioner, Sue Morgan. We all are there, and we try and get the cause of disease. That's what our thing is. We're not just there to give you something to patch you up to make you feel better. We certainly want you to feel better. We want to get to the cause of your conditions. And that's kind of, I would say, the theme of the place, is we get to causality. And usually, that's a they and not it. There are multiple causes of disease, and that's what we work for. So I'm going to open up for questions now. And
Well, we were always taught that breakfast is simple.
yep. So what you could do is you could eat breakfast and eat lunch, skip dinner. See, but if you're going to try the 16-hour fast, by the way, I don't say you have to do that. It's just an interesting concept. So
Well, I drink with sugar plus eat because I'm stressed out, you said no shakes, well, that's a shake.
yeah.
So I have to drink it.
Well, I understand. Yeah.
I noticed in your brochure that she was saying naturopathic medicine, which is highly recognized in the West. Do they even acknowledge it here in the state?
I do.
Well,
Well, first of all, they had a law that after my naturopathic degree is not, they let the law that covered naturopaths sunset in the state as well. They moved it to get it back. It's virtually in every other state, but for some reason Florida decided not to renew it. But and so I don't practice any of my naturopathic license. I practice under my other licenses.
Did you go to Bryn Mawr by any chance?
No. Yeah.
Just want to compliment you on your presentation. I came for something else today, and you were sort of the package that was here.
I said, then you need to stay for Dr. Springer. That's what
And I
I
said, okay. And it was very informative, and it explains why, when you listen to your body, why you stop eating certain things, because it just doesn't feel right. And that part on the beans, you know, you always think you should eat the beans, and it's killing you. So very, very, very knowledgeable and very informative, really.
Yes,
Is
sir.
a touch of ketones in your blood acceptable?
Well, you want, well, first of all, in your blood, that's how they get to where they're going to get to. So yes, the answer is yes. What you really usually measure ketones going to be in your urine. So you'll know if you're actually in some level of ketosis. Because you have little strips you can get that will actually turn purple when you're in ketosis. You like ketosis. Ketosis actually helps, your body burns fat better than it does glucose. Yes.
Quinoa is a seed, not a grain.
That's
Is
correct.
that all right?
No, it's not.
Not
Not seed. So what was it going to By the way, for those of you who need to leave, thank you very much for your patience. I went way over. Had a lot of fun. Thank you much.